This is the Fujifilm XF100-400 telephoto zoom lens. Now I'm here in Iceland at the moment. I've been here for about a week or so shooting the landscapes here. I do a lot of my landscape work with a telephoto lens, so I was very curious to see what this would bring, what this would give me for my work. I usually use the 55-200, which is a great lens. I chose it primarily because it's really light, really small, super easy and compact to carry, and I do like to travel as fast and light as possible. But I've always been curious about this lens. I've been curious about the extra reach, what that would give me, about the extra quality, and just to see if it could kind of give me a different perspective in my landscape photography. So in this review, I'm going to be focusing principally on that from a landscape perspective. Looking at what it gives you in terms of the extra reach, in terms of the quality and the flexibility of the lens. Now, it is a great lens. I've really enjoyed using it. It's very heavy. Straight is the first thing that you notice. It's a big, heavy lens. It weighs in at 1,350 grams. The closest other lens in Fuji's lineup to this is the 70-300 in terms of focal length, and that weighs in at something at about 580 grams. So this is more than double the weight of that. And it's about 8 centimeters longer, a lot wider, a lot bulkier. So you're going to feel the difference straight away in terms of the weight and the size of it to carry around with you. And you don't get that much extra reach. It's just 100 millimeters longer, but you lose 30 millimeters at the wide end because it only starts at 100. The build quality is superb. I've been using this in some really nasty weather in Iceland. We used it in some heavy rainfall. We've been shooting in places where there's been a lot of dust flying. I shot at the volcanic eruption, and I've not had any concerns at all about the weather sealing, which I rarely do with Fuji lenses because I think that they're all built to a very high quality. But this is clearly a quality lens. It's a red badge lens, which is marked as one of Fuji's top-end zooms, and it really does feel premium. It's solid metal, very sturdy, really, really nice to use. And all the rings here, like the zoom ring, the focus ring, are super big, easy to grip, have a nice level of resistance to them. There's no zoom creep at all in this lens, and it's not a new lens. This is a demonstration copy that Fujifilm have lent me. So this lens has been out in the field and used a lot, and it doesn't have any zoom creep at all, which is nice, and it is something that characterizes some of the less expensive zooms like the 70-300 or the 55-200. So in terms of the build quality, this is excellent. Another thing that I really like about it is the tripod mount on the bottom, which means you can mount this on a tripod with the weight of the lens in the middle. With zoom lenses like the 70-300 or the 55-200, you're connecting them via the camera, so they're very top heavy. So first of all, that unbalances your tripod a little bit, and if you're shooting in high wind or things like that, which you do a lot in the landscape, I've certainly been doing that a lot here in Iceland, you have a less stable tripod. And the other thing about this is that having the weight centered means that when you're using a ball head, which I do, quite often when you frame your composition and you tighten off the ball head, there's a little bit of drift. The camera will drift down a little bit as the weight of the lens just settles in the ball head. It just goes down a few millimeters, but with a telephoto, that's enough to change your composition quite significantly sometimes. Having this tripod mount in the middle is really useful. It kind of changes that a lot. So when you frame your composition and then tighten the ball head on the tripod, you know that it's pretty much steady, that you'll keep the same composition, even though it's a considerably heavier lens than the 70-300. So I love things like that. I also love the fact when you have a tripod mount, you can just loosen it here and switch to vertical perspective, keeping the same composition. I'm not using the L bracket, so I don't have to flip the camera around the L bracket. I can just rotate it through that. And that's something that I do find really useful because I do switch compositions a lot from vertical to horizontal and back again, and it's really, really nice. The downside of this, I found from a shooting perspective, is the fact that it is very long. I shoot a lot in the 55-100, 120 range. That's kind of my sweet spot for telephoto landscapes. And I missed that a lot. I think that because of that, this lens probably pairs very well with something like the 16-80, but I don't have that lens with me. I didn't bring it. So I had a gap between the 55 from the 18-55, which I was carrying with me on this trip, and the 100 of this, and that gap for me is quite a significant gap. It's quite a relevant gap. which I really did miss a lot. So in terms of this in conjunction with other lenses, I think then it starts to get a little bit complicated what you're going to bring with you. The 16 to 80 is ideal, but are you going to bring something like the 55 to 200, in which case you have a quite similar zooms with a big crossover. And I think it's a hard lens to carry and carry just one other zoom with you, because if you're like me and you also need to have an ultra wide zoom, so I carry with me the 10 to 24 all the time, it starts to get complicated, and the number of lenses in my bags that I'm going to need for coverage starts to build up. And that's not something I like personally. I like to have just 2 lenses, 3 at the absolute most. And with this, even with 3 lenses, I still have a significant gap in the coverage in an area that I do use a lot. So I did find that I was quite often frustrated with this lens at not being able to go wide, at not being able to go below 100. So I think from that perspective, the 70 to 300 is a slightly more versatile lens, because that's a range that I use more often than the 300 to 400 bit at the other end. If you're shooting wildlife, then that's probably a different thing. You probably really do appreciate that extra reach to get the wildlife closer. But from a landscape perspective, I didn't find that it gave me that much. It is nice, for example, when we were out at the volcano eruption site, being able to get that a lot closer. For that, I did use it, and I did use it to create some nice abstracts. But overall, that loss for me, what I lose was more significant to me than what I gained at the long end. I did bring, this works with the teleconverter as well, and I did bring the 2x teleconverter along, which gives a huge range. You can see here I was able to shoot an image of the moon on the first night that I had the lens and not have to crop into it at all. It's an incredible reach. So it doubles the reach of this to 800, which is 1,200 millimeters in full frame equivalent. And that's a massive reach. But using the teleconverter, you do lose 2 stops of light. So when you're shooting at the long end at 400, because this is an f4.5 to 5.6 variable aperture zoom, when you're shooting at 400, the minimum aperture is f11, which is really quite small, and it means your shutter speed is extended, or you have to increase your ISO quite a bit to get the light in. And I did notice that with the 2x teleconverter, at least, it was a little bit softer. And also bringing the 2x teleconverter, it adds weight. It's not particularly heavy, but it is about 170 grams. So overall, you're putting even more weight in your bag, more bulk in your bag. So I found that I didn't use the teleconverter that often, a couple of times out at the volcano eruption, but for the most part, it wasn't something that I felt I needed, certainly with the reach of this. And the 70 to 300 also works with a teleconverter. So you can get very similar performance, very similar reach, unless you're really looking to bring subjects, really small subjects that are very far away, close to you. I do think that the 70 to 300 has a more flexible and more useful focal range than this lens. Now the lens does have OIS, optical image stabilization, which works really well in conjunction with the in-body stabilization in cameras like the XS4 and the XT4. On this trip I've been using it with the XS10, which is this camera here, and the wide angle has been on my XT4. And the stabilization has really impressed me, the way that the two things work together. With long focal lengths, any vibration is really magnified down the focal length. The longer you shoot, the more any vibrational shake is pronounced. And this really did impress me. I was able to shoot at relatively low shutter speeds, something like 1/50, at focal lengths of something like 400, without worrying about camera shake, with both the lens and the camera keeping the image really nice and stable when I was shooting handheld. And I did find that with the XS10, with this really deep grip it's got, it balances really well. It's very easy to hold the lens and keep it really steady. Despite its size and bulk, it really does work very well with this camera. Now in terms of image quality, I haven't had a chance yet to compare this with the 55 to 200 because I left that lens at home as I wanted to travel light. And when I get back home to Lisbon, what I'll do is a few comparison shots across focal ranges and apertures just to see how the two lenses compare. But overall in the field, I have been really happy with this, but I'm not going to really know about the performance until I get home and have a look at it on my computer screen. So these are some comparison shots that I took back home in Lisbon with the 55-200 and the 100-400. I would have liked to have used the 70-300, but I don't actually have that lens. I just borrowed it to make a review of it, so I'm just going to compare it with the 55-200. So this is at about 100 millimeter. You can see on the left is the 55-200 and on the right is the 100-400. I tried to keep the settings similar. There's a slight difference here in the f-stop because I've got to change it between the cameras. But because the scene is a couple of 100 meters away, the depth of field really shouldn't have any effect on the sharpness. So what I noticed is that up here on the top right, actually some of this detail around the sign here and on the street sign here looks actually sharper on the 55-200. But when you get into the lower bottom corner here, when we look at this sign and this sign, the car number plates, the back of this sign here, then I would say that the 100-400 is a little bit sharper there, but they're both very sharp lenses. I've always been quite happy with the 55-200 as a lens. So the next focal length is at about 135. So again, we've got the 55-200 on the left and the 100-400 on the right. So let's have a look. And I think here, when we look at the street sign, again, the 55-200 is comparable, but there are small differences going deeper into the scene. I think the railing here seems to have a slight bit more detail, but again, not really a huge amount of difference. I used f7.1 here. The settings are both the same for this shot. Because that's principally, the middle of the aperture range is principally where I do most of my shooting for landscape photographs. If you open the lens up to shoot at the widest aperture, then you may have a different result, but I'm only really interested in the middle of the aperture range, which is principally because I'm a landscape shooter. But again, when you get to the bottom left, the 100-400 is quite a little bit sharper when we look around the signpost there and around the parking sign and the parking meter, the number plate of this front car. It seems to be a fair bit sharper, and going up the street to look at the top, there's not really that much difference between them there. So the next one we're going to look at is at around 200. So let's have a look here. Now, usually this is where you would see a difference because the 55-200 does drop off in quality quite a bit after about 150 millimeters. So if we just look on the back of the street sign here, we can see it is quite a bit softer than the 100-400, which is to be expected because the 100-400 is still in the middle of its zoom range here. It's not at the end, and just moving up, there is a lot more sharpness all the way up the street. Looking at the detail in the cars, when we go over to the left, we look at the detail around these flowers and on the railing around the lamppost. It is quite a bit sharper, and I think that's even more noticeable when we go back down into the corners. Not so much actually. They've both got a little bit of softness there. But looking at the number plates, there's more detail here in the car on the right with the 100-400. Now, I know I showed this briefly earlier in the video, but let's just have a comparison of the lens with and without a teleconverter. So here on the left, you've got the lens at about 200 millimeters, and on the right, you've got the lens at 100 millimeter with the 2x teleconverter to bring that up to about the same focal length. And there's not really a huge amount of difference, but I really do think when you look at high detail areas like this railing here on the left compared with here on the right, and the parking meter, the number plate here, you can see that it does get quite a bit softer with the teleconverter. Again, I kept the apertures the same. Now let's just look at right at the end of the lens. So this is at 400. So 400 with the lens, 200 with the teleconverter, again doubled to bring it up to about the same focal length. But you can see here that even at 400 millimeters, the lens is really sharp. It performs better at the end of its focal length, 400, than the 55-200 does at the end of its focal length. You can see here the amount of detail where you can see the printing on the back of these signs and the flowers here. And when we compare that with the teleconverter, you can see how much softer that is. We go and move down the street, the detail and things like the front of the yellow on this wheelbarrow, and then the front of the cars here. I don't know if we can't really see any license plates there, but generally you can see it is quite a bit sharper without the teleconverter. The teleconverter does make it a bit softer. And looking at this at 400, you can see that pretty much all the way through the focal length, it is a very sharp lens. Although towards the wider end, around 100 to 135, there really isn't that much difference between this and the 55 to 200. So overall then, what do I think of this lens for landscapes? Well, during the course of this trip, the last week in Iceland, it's been very much a love-hate relationship with this. There are times when it's really frustrated me because we've been out on some really long hikes. We've been out with the camera backpacks for like 6 or 7 hours. I've done 15 kilometers. I've scaled something like 400, 500 meter peaks, really soft sand, carrying this, my other camera, the drone, water, tripod. It starts to get really heavy, and I've really not appreciated having a lens that weighs so much and takes up so much space in my backpack. I've also been frustrated with the focal length. There have been so many times when I've been wanting to shoot around about 80 millimeters or 75 millimeters, and I've not had a lens that will give me that. So that could be partially solved by having something like 16 to 80, but unless you want to carry multiple lenses, there aren't really many solutions to have this and not really have some significant gaps in the focal range. However, there have also been times when I've really loved having this lens. So many times when the extra reach has allowed me to really zoom in on the landscape, create abstract images that I've really liked that I would never have been able to get with something like the 55 to 200 or the 70 to 300, or okay, maybe I could do that if I had the teleconverter as well. But it's just been really lovely to be able to really pull landscapes closer to me, to be able to zoom in, try different compositions and create some abstract images. I've really liked the tripod mount. I've liked being able to reframe by rotating the camera. Those things are great. It's also a really high performing lens. It's super sharp, gives you great looking images, and I really am impressed with the build quality and how solid and reliable and dependable it is. But given a choice between this lens and the 70 to 300 or the 55 to 200, I won't be unhappy to give this back to Fuji. I do think that I do prefer smaller, light telephoto zoom. So overall then, really good lens. It has very specific use case scenarios, I think, and whether you go for something like this is very much a personal choice, what kind of photography you do, how comfortable you are with the extra weight. So I think that's pretty much everything for this video. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's been interesting. If you've got any questions at all, just drop me an email or drop me a comment in the box below and I'll try to get back to you. I'll be back in Iceland again next year. I'll be doing lots of trips to other places. So if you'd like to come here with me and do a workshop with me, I'd love to have you along. You can find information about all the different workshops I'll be leading next year and in the years after that on my website. So please check it out. And that's pretty much it. So as ever, thanks for watching and take care. See ya.